It was the summer of 1996, and the air conditioning unit in my bedroom window sounded less like a machine cooling the stifling suburban air, and more like a cheap jet engine perpetually trying to take off. That sound, coupled with the low, persistent hiss leaking from the old Zenith tube television in the corner, formed the soundtrack to my life. A teenage existence spent tethered to the arcane world of late-night cable. I was 16, living in the blandest stretch of Connecticut's suburbia, and my obsession wasn't video games or girls, but the dead hours between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the forgotten slice of the broadcast day where the signal felt thin and frayed, like the whole infrastructure was ready to collapse. This was the territory of low-budget infomercials, static-drenched reruns of sitcoms nobody cared about, and the truly bizarre public access programming that felt beamed in from another dimension. My weapon of choice was a clunky, top-loading JVC VCR, which I had dedicated solely to archiving the ghosts of the analog signal. The brief dropouts, the color bleeds, the moments when the cable company's feed seemed to momentarily give way to something else. Most of it was just noise, snow, audio clicks, the bleed over from shortwave radio. But that night, as I was watching a deeply depressing, badly lit infomercial for a specialized kind of ceramic cooking knife on Channel 17, a local independent station that usually just showed syndicated trash, I saw it. It wasn't a sudden burst of static. It was far too intentional for that. It was a single, perfect, instantaneous flicker. The image on the screen, the sweaty pitchman waving the ceramic blade, didn't pixelate or distort. It was simply replaced entirely, for maybe 1/30th of a second, by something else. My heart jumped because the timing was too precise, too abrupt. It wasn't a cable drag, it was an edit, a professional splice inserted with surgical precision into the feed. I rewound the tape immediately, my fingers slick against the VCR controls, the whirring of the magnetic ribbon sounding impossibly loud in the otherwise silent house. I put the VCR into slow-motion playback, then frame by frame. The tape struggled, the image strobing, until finally I hit the exact moment. What appeared on the screen lasted only long enough for the human eye to register it as a flash, a brief retinal burn, but the VCR captured the clean, singular frame. It wasn't static, it wasn't interference, it was a picture. It was dark, composed primarily of blacks and deep, muddy greens, but it contained structure. It looked like an extremely crude, low-resolution drawing of a symbol, not a letter, not a number, but a geometric shape overlaid with jagged, unnatural lines. And beneath the symbol, stretched across the bottom of the screen in what looked like the blocky, digitized font from an old Atari game, was a sequence of characters: B47X90. It was the deepest, most chilling realization of my obsession. I wasn't just recording technical errors. I was recording a broadcast that was never meant to be seen. The discovery of the B47X90 signal instantly elevated my late-night habit from harmless teenage eccentricity to something bordering on an unsanctioned scientific endeavor. I spent the next 4 weeks doing nothing but trawling the dead channels, my room now a humid nest of tangled coaxial cables, stacked VHS cassettes, and the perpetually buzzing television set. I quickly learned that the signal was highly selective and ephemeral. It never appeared on the major network affiliates, nor the premium movie channels like HBO or Showtime, which were guarded by far more robust signal encryption and filtering. The signal exclusively targeted the weakest links in the cable infrastructure. Channel 17, the local syndicated trash loop. Channel 23, the municipal bulletin board which showed silent slides of council meeting agendas. And most disturbingly, the residual analog bleed from Channel 41, which was nominally dedicated to late-night religious programming, but often devolved into raw static and buzz after 3:30 a.m. I began meticulously logging every instance, dating the tapes, noting the exact program it interrupted, and calculating the precise duration of the broadcast flicker. Mark, my only friend who occasionally braved the nocturnal hours with me, remained frustratingly skeptical. He thought I had simply found a consistent technical glitch related to the Channel 17 transmitter tower located 10 miles away, or maybe a poorly shielded microwave oven in the apartment building across the street. "It's just analog noise, Alex," he'd argue, usually while playing a muffled cassette tape of grunge music. "Signals get crossed. You're assigning meaning to interference." But I knew better. Interference is chaotic. It is random. This was ordered. The appearance of the cryptic frame was always punctual, almost always occurring between 3:12 a.m. and 3:28 a.m., and it was structured. It wasn't just the symbol and the alphanumeric sequence. The imagery behind the text began to shift and evolve. I invested the entirety of my summer job earnings, money that was supposed to go toward a beat-up Honda Civic, into a cheap second-hand frame grabber card for my dinosaur of a 486 PC. Hooking the VCR output to the frame grabber was a nightmare of driver conflicts and low-resolution bottlenecks. But finally, I managed to capture the single frames as clean digital JPEG files, stripping away the VCR's inherent blurring. This allowed me to study the subtle details. The symbols were indeed crude, but consistent, almost looking like the rudimentary visual language found in ancient cave paintings or early computer graphics. More importantly, when I juxtaposed 10 different captured frames, I realized the full alphanumeric sequence wasn't random. It was a sequential code. B47X90 was followed days later by C11A52, and then D93P8R. This wasn't a broadcast error. This was data transmission, parceled out in millisecond increments, hidden in plain sight, and designed to evade standard human perception. It was a ghost broadcast existing within the electrical veins of suburban America, and I was the only one staring hard enough to see its pulse. The 486 hummed relentlessly in my tiny room, its monitor casting a pale, sickly green glow over the stacks of recorded tapes. Deciphering the alphanumeric sequence became an obsession that cost me sleep, summer socializing, and the tenuous goodwill of my parents. The frames themselves were terrifying enough, brief glimpses of unsettling stillness. One frame, labeled E50Z1C, displayed what appeared to be the interior of a tiled room, possibly a bathroom or an abandoned shower stall, lit by a single, weak bulb hanging from a bare wire. The image was grainy, almost impressionistic, but the overall feeling was one of profound neglect and silence, punctuated only by the blocky white text overlaid on the bottom third. Another sequence, F22Y7K, showed only the corner of a dimly lit street, the type of nondescript suburban corner that exists everywhere, dominated by the hulking, shadowy outline of a large oak tree. The horror wasn't in the explicit imagery, but in the chilling mundanity of the locations. They looked like anywhere. They looked like here. My breakthrough came through an incredibly obscure source, an old amateur radio operator's handbook I found in a dusty corner of a university library sale. I had been experimenting with every standard encryption and coding format I could find: Caesar ciphers, Vigenère, simple base conversions, all yielding only gibberish. The handbook mentioned a rarely used, almost archaic method of military signal compression and transmission called burst code T4, used briefly during the early Cold War for relaying highly sensitive, location-specific data points across vulnerable analog radio links. The key characteristic of T4 was its dependency on alternating coordinates. The first 3 characters were always a location marker, often latitude-longitude approximated for municipal grids, and the last 3 characters were a time or instruction cipher. I theorized that the letters B, C, D, etc. indicated the level of precision, and the numbers were the coordinates themselves. After weeks of cross-referencing the translated numerical outputs with old municipal maps and a rudimentary version of mapping software I ran on the slow PC, the coordinates finally began to coalesce. They weren't global or vague. They pointed to a hyperlocal area, specifically to a small, unincorporated borough roughly 60 miles due north of my house, near the town of New Canaan. The location was precise to a 4-block radius. The remaining 3 characters, the instruction cipher, were far more difficult, but after running them through the T4's established phonetic conversion table, the message came through, slow, agonizingly structured, and undeniably clear. Prepare. Await. Signal. This wasn't an accident. This was a message, and now I was holding the key. The sheer organizational effort required to synchronize this signal across multiple, low-power analog frequencies during the broadcast dead zone struck me as the most terrifying element. This wasn't the work of one lonely hacker with a powerful antenna. This required coordination, resources, and a deep understanding of the archaic infrastructure of 1990s cable distribution. Who had the motivation and the technical know-how to essentially hijack the fringe bandwidths of 3 separate channels just to flicker 6 characters and a disturbing image onto the screen for 33 milliseconds at a time? I began tracing the signal bleed, physically driving to the local broadcast hubs during the daytime, pretending to be a college student researching electromagnetic pollution. I discovered that Channel 17, Channel 23, and the religious Channel 41 shared a single, aging analog head end, a facility where all the signals were aggregated and cleaned before distribution. This meant the insertion point wasn't coming from 3 separate locations. It was happening at the central nexus. Someone had access to the master feed. Or, more chillingly, they had inserted a device that was capable of overriding the legitimate programming at the very last moment before transmission to the local node. The pattern was immutable. The transmissions always began precisely at 3:12 a.m. and ceased by 3:30 a.m. Why this window? My best guess, supported by reading several dry technical manuals on broadcast standards, was that 3 a.m. was the lowest usage point for the main distribution line, minimizing the chance of detection by routine diagnostic sweeps. It was the moment the system went to sleep. The realization that this operation was professional, silent, and highly concealed added a thick layer of dread. This wasn't some teenage prank or a local pirate station. This felt like something designed to communicate under the strict radar of official surveillance, or perhaps something that had official complicity. I started sketching out the repeating symbols I had captured. When arranged in chronological order, based on the date and timestamp from my VCRs, they began to resemble components of a larger schematic. Not a geographical map this time, but a flowchart or an architectural diagram. Lines connecting points, small squares, and occasional extremely brief flashes of text in the captured frames that were too fast for the T4 cipher to encode completely. These brief garbled fragments looked like operational commands: deploy, access, verify. I found myself sinking deeper into paranoia, double-checking the locks on my bedroom door, convinced that whoever was broadcasting this data stream was operating locally, maybe even within a few miles of my house. The imagery was getting darker, too. The latest frame, captured during a particularly snowy broadcast of a syndicated police procedural, showed the interior of a dimly lit bedroom. The focal point was a dresser, and sitting atop the dresser, facing the camera, was a doll, an antique porcelain doll with unnaturally wide black eyes. The blocky text below simply read, "Target identified, proceed," which felt less like a general instruction and more like a terrifyingly specific threat aimed directly at the viewer who was staring too hard. The translation of the full sequence of coordinates led me to a defunct industrial park, known locally as the Black Iron Works, a massive, sprawling complex of brick buildings and rusted piping that had manufactured specialty electronics components until the late 80s, when it shut down almost overnight, amidst rumors of environmental violations and mysterious layoffs. It was exactly the kind of abandoned, forgotten place that would appeal to someone needing a secure, shielded location for clandestine broadcasting. Now armed with the decoded location and the unsettling instruction, "Prepare, await, signal," I had to make a choice. Was this an elaborate, potentially dangerous hoax? Was it some kind of experimental art project utilizing early stealth broadcasting techniques? Or was it something truly nefarious, a communication system for people engaged in activities that the light of day could not tolerate? The coordinates indicated not just the park, but a specific structure within it, Building C, the former assembly warehouse, which was known to be structurally unsound and mostly boarded up. My skepticism battled fiercely with the cold, hard evidence on my VHS tapes. The organization, the consistent time slots, the utilization of an obscure Cold War cipher. It was too complex to be random. I showed the assembled data, the mapped coordinates, the stack of physical tapes to Mark, who finally stopped playing devil's advocate and started looking genuinely unnerved. The porcelain doll image had done the trick. It was too unnervingly specific, too invasive. The decision was made. We had to go. But before we risked driving 60 miles into the heart of a decaying industrial wasteland, I sat back, staring at the green text glowing on my monitor, the culmination of weeks of total immersion in this disturbing signal. It made me wonder about the nature of unseen communication, the information that constantly washes over us, unnoticed. If a message this complex, this detailed, could be inserted into the public broadcast stream without detection for months, what else is hiding in the noise? What other unseen conspiracies or private horrors are being coordinated right now, just beyond the threshold of our perception, utilizing the very infrastructure we rely upon for entertainment and comfort? And if we, as passive consumers, allow the silence and the dead zones to become breeding grounds for these hidden broadcasts, are we, in some way, tacitly inviting the unknown and the sinister into our lives? Tell me, have you ever caught a fleeting moment of anomaly on your screen, a flash of static, or a strange interference that felt intentional? Do you believe that some truths are hidden only because we simply aren't looking closely enough? Share your thoughts and your own frightening discoveries in the comments below, because sometimes knowing you aren't alone in watching the dark corners is the only thing that keeps the shadows at bay. The answers, or at least the start of them, lay 60 miles away. The drive to the Black Ironworks was long, humid, and punctuated by the rattling of my mother's borrowed, ancient Buick Skylark. We used paper maps and landmark navigation, the satellite guidance of the future still years away, adding to the feeling that we were venturing into a genuinely forgotten corner of the world. Mark gripped a rusted tire iron under his seat, a pathetic offering against the unknown, while I nervously fiddled with the car radio, hoping for some kind of ambient reassurance. As we approached the perimeter of the industrial park, the landscape shifted dramatically from manicured suburban lawns to overgrown fields choked with kudzu and punctuated by skeletal remnants of factory infrastructure. The air hung heavy with the metallic scent of rust and damp concrete. Building C, the target of the signal, was exactly as described, a massive monolithic structure of blackened brick, its hundreds of windows either shattered or covered with corroded steel plating. The main entrance was sealed with a heavy chain, but around the back, near the loading docks, years of neglect had created a perfect entry point. A section of corrugated aluminum siding had pulled away from the brick facade, leaving a gap just wide enough for two nervous teenagers to squeeze through. Inside, the warehouse was a cavernous, echoing space, silent save for the drip of water and the scuttling sounds of unseen vermin. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of sunlight slicing through the cracks in the roof, illuminating skeletal machinery draped in cobwebs. We used cheap, weak flashlights, the kind with the fading yellow beam, to navigate the treacherous interior. The atmosphere was oppressive. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath. We weren't looking for bodies or treasure. We were looking for a high-tech broadcast center hidden inside a derelict shell. We followed my rough, printed-out schematics, heading towards the area that once housed the electrical maintenance substation. It took 20 terrifying minutes of crawling under collapsed ductwork and stepping around deep, oily pools of stagnant water, but then we found it. Tucked away behind a makeshift wall constructed of stacked wooden pallets and black plastic sheeting was a room that was chillingly different from the rest of the decay. This room was clean. The floor was swept, and while the air was thick with the faint smell of ozone and old electronics, it lacked the pervasive rot of the rest of the building. In the center of the small windowless space stood the operational heart of the hidden broadcast. It wasn't modern, sleek equipment. That would have been too noticeable. Instead, it was an array of cobbled-together analog technology. Racks of early '80s signal conditioners, a massive humming industrial-grade transmitter tower, clearly stolen or salvaged from a defunct military base, and a terrifyingly simple input device. The transmitter was connected directly to a cheap off-the-shelf VCR, the same model I had at home, in fact, sitting innocently on a folding card table. The power cord ran directly into a professional-grade generator humming faintly in the corner, muffled by thick acoustic foam. The sight of the consumer-grade VCR hooked up to the professional broadcast array was the single most unsettling detail of the entire discovery. It proved that the source of the signal was physical, tangible, and terrifyingly amateur in its delivery method, yet professional in its execution. Someone was using the simplest possible input, a VHS tape, to drive a broadcast signal powerful enough to bleed into the cable infrastructure 60 miles away. We stood frozen, the beams of our weak flashlights illuminating the pristine yet makeshift setup. Mark moved first, his hand instinctively reaching for the power switch on the generator. "We shut it down now," he whispered, his voice cracking with adrenaline. I stopped him. "No, the tape. We have to see what's on the tape. That's the source material. That's the full signal." My hands trembled as I approached the VCR. The machine was slightly warm to the touch. I pressed the eject button. The mechanism whirred, and a standard, unmarked black VHS cassette, the type sold in 10 packs at any pharmacy in the '90s, slowly rose from the slot. I carefully removed the tape. Just as I did, a new sequence of clicks and hums started emanating from the industrial transmitter rack. The lights on the signal conditioner began to flicker rapidly, like a machine waking up. Panic flared. The machine wasn't designed to stop when the tape finished. It was designed to run a loop. I looked at the wall clock hanging above the equipment. It was 3:07 a.m. We had arrived just minutes before the scheduled transmission window. Whoever operated this wasn't here, but their system was ready to fire. I quickly slammed the tape I had just retrieved into the VCR I had carried with me, my own recorder, which I had brought along solely for documentation purposes. Mark guarded the doorway, his tire iron raised uselessly against the incoming darkness. I hit play. What flashed onto the small portable monitor I had also lugged along was not the millisecond flicker I had analyzed for weeks. This was the raw, unedited footage that formed the basis of the hidden broadcast. It was silent, distorted with low-frequency grain, and lasted exactly 10 minutes and 4 seconds before looping. It started with a long, unmoving shot of a suburban living room at night. Everything looked normal. A floral sofa, a small television set showing a faint blue screen, a shelf of unremarkable paperback books. But standing stock still in the middle of the room, facing directly into the camera, was a figure. They were dressed in ordinary clothes, a pale blue bathrobe perhaps, their face obscured by shadow, but their posture was rigidly unnatural, hands hanging stiffly at their sides. This static shot lasted for nearly 2 minutes. Then, the footage caught violently. A brief flash, a human figure running past a hedge in the dark, so fast it was almost subliminal. Then another long, static shot, this time inside a dimly lit kitchen. Again, a person stood motionless, staring. The fear hit me like a physical blow. These weren't fictional sets. These were real, unassuming homes. These were candid recordings, captured in secret of people who had no idea they were being filmed. The horror escalated when the footage cut again, this time showing a close-up of a child's hand drawing on a steamed-up window pane. The child was silent, their breath fogging the glass, and they were methodically sketching the very symbol, the jagged geometric shape that had haunted my captured frames for weeks. They were teaching the signal. The tape concluded with a final unnerving shot of a dark hallway, ending abruptly on a single perfectly clear frame of text superimposed over the image, the next set of coordinates, and the chilling phrase, "The audience is acknowledged. Prepare for viewing." The simple elegance of the terror struck me immediately. The signal wasn't just data being transmitted to someone. It was content, designed to be seen by the few people, the obsessive analog anomaly hunters like me, who would bother to look. The phrase, "the audience is acknowledged," ripped away the comfort of viewing this as a conspiracy between strangers. It was personal. They knew someone was watching. They might even have designed the transmission method specifically to attract the kind of analytical, paranoid observer who would meticulously decode a millisecond flicker. I slammed the eject button on my portable VCR and grabbed the unmarked source tape, my mind racing through escape scenarios. Mark was pale, eyes wide and fixed on the industrial transmitter, which was now cycling through its pre-broadcast diagnostics, the low hum deepening into a resonant, powerful drone. "We need to destroy this," Mark whispered, pointing at the massive equipment rack. "Now, before they start broadcasting tonight's message." We didn't waste time looking for a proper off switch. The power was coming from the generator. Mark grabbed the tire iron and, with a grunt of fear and adrenaline, brought it down hard on the array of analog switches and indicator lights on the front of the transmitter unit. Plastic shattered, sparks flew, and the deep, resonant hum instantly died, replaced by a fizzling sound of short-circuiting wires. The tiny red light on the VCR went dark. We were running purely on panic, fueled by the realization that we were not just observers, but trespassers in a system that was watching us back. Grabbing both the unmarked source tape and the tape I had just recorded the full transmission onto, we bolted out of the small room, scrambling back through the maze of collapsed ductwork and damp concrete. The return trip through the industrial park was a blur of fear. Every shadow seemed to move. Every echoing drip of water sounded like footsteps pursuing us. When we finally reached the battered Buick and tore out of the parking lot, I didn't breathe until we were 10 miles down the highway, surrounded by the ordinary neon glow of late-night gas stations and fast food signs. The familiarity of the suburban night felt like a fragile shield. When we arrived back at my house in the early hours of the morning, Mark, visibly traumatized, refused to stay. He dropped me off and sped away, leaving me alone with the two precious, terrifying tapes. I went straight to my room, heart hammering, determined to analyze the full tape again, to extract the new coordinates before the dread overwhelmed me. I slammed the source tape into my trusty JVC VCR, hit play, and immediately noticed a terrifying change. The video quality of the raw broadcast had deteriorated drastically. The static shots of the living rooms were now almost unrecognizable, covered in rolling interference lines and color distortion. The critical frame, the one containing the next set of coordinates and the phrase, "the audience is acknowledged," was now nothing but a smear of white noise. It was as if the magnetic information was actively decaying, corrupted by the mere act of being played outside the controlled environment of the transmitter. The signal was self-destructing, ensuring that the critical information could only be received through the instantaneous flicker, forcing the viewer to piece together the fragments without ever seeing the whole. The full, chilling horror of their methodology settled over me. The broadcast wasn't meant to transmit static data. It was meant to transmit the feeling of being watched, using the decay of the evidence as the final, most terrifying component of the message. The rapid, catastrophic degradation of the magnetic ribbon on the source tape intensified my paranoia tenfold. It confirmed that the broadcast system was engineered not just for stealth, but for plausible deniability. The evidence literally vanished the moment you tried to study it too closely. The signal was designed to be ephemeral, a phantom truth existing only in the brief, jarring moment of transmission. My room now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a surveillance hub. I couldn't shake the image of those perfectly still figures standing in ordinary homes, staring into a camera I couldn't see, knowing that the same unseen lens might be focused on me right now. I decided the priority was not to chase the next set of now lost coordinates, but to understand why the images in the original sequence were chosen. I reviewed my collection of frame grabs, the hundreds of brief flickers I had catalogued. I zoomed in on every discernible detail of the environments. The initial frames were generic, but as the sequence progressed, B47X90 through to the final sequence, the locations became subtly more specific, more local. The last few frames, the ones captured right before our raid on the Black Ironworks, were the most disturbing. I focused on the image of the porch light and the oversized oak tree. I recognized that street corner. It was 2 blocks from my local high school. Then I focused on the porcelain doll sitting on the dresser. That dresser was familiar, the specific grain of the wood, the slightly peeling veneer near the drawer handle. I frantically checked local police reports and old community newspapers from the late 80s, looking for any connection to the Black Ironworks, or perhaps any strange missing person reports near the coordinates. Nothing conclusive emerged, only the usual suburban mundanity. But the final, crushing blow came as I sat there, exhausted and defeated, staring at the grainy image of the porcelain doll on the screen grab. The background was blurry, but there was a distinct calendar hanging slightly askew on the wall behind the dresser. The date prominently circled in red marker was July 14th, 1996. That date was 3 days ago. My blood ran cold, not just because the filming was recent, but because, as my eyes darted around my own dimly lit room, I realized something horrifying about the dresser in the picture. It wasn't just similar to a local style, it was the exact model that my parents owned, stored up in their attic after they bought a new set last year. The unsettling realization began to crystallize. The target-identified frames weren't random houses. They were scouted, nearby locations, carefully selected for the next phase of the operation. And the final, self-destructing sequence we intercepted was the acknowledgement of me. The signal wasn't just meant to be seen, it was meant to be hunted. And the hunter, once identified, became the focus of the next broadcast. The entire system was an elaborate, magnetic lure designed to draw out the solitary observer, the kind of person obsessed enough to look into the darkness. I destroyed every single piece of evidence that night. The tapes, the VCR, the frame grabber card, even dismantling the 486 and soaking the hard drive in the bathtub, driven by a primal need to erase the digital footprints of my investigation. But the deepest fear remained, the realization that simply watching invited the signal, and whatever controlled it, directly into my life. Days blurred into a week of oppressive silence and heightened anxiety. I avoided the television, avoiding the living room, convinced that the Zenith TV in my bedroom was not just a device, but an exposed nerve waiting to transmit the next horrifying revelation. The silence was worse than the static. Mark, distant and haunted, refused to speak about the Black Ironworks incident, treating our trip as a shared nightmare we mutually agreed never happened. I started seeing things, brief visual slivers that mimicked the structure of the broadcast flicker. A flash of light in the corner of my vision, a sudden change in the quality of the ambient light, the way a shadow fell across the pavement, all interpreted through the filter of a mind now attuned to the millisecond intrusion. The paranoia was relentless. I checked the house obsessively, looking for hidden cameras, micro-transmitters, or anything that would indicate I was still being observed. I found nothing, which only intensified the dread. The knowledge that they could transmit to me, but I could not locate them, meant they held all the power. I began to understand the signal's true purpose. It wasn't a military code or a numbers station. It was psychological warfare waged at the ultra-local level, designed to create singular, isolated points of terror in its dedicated viewers. It was the broadcast equivalent of staring back from the abyss. The memory of the porcelain doll on the familiar dresser haunted my sleep, making the attic feel like a repository of latent horror. One night, unable to sleep, I crept downstairs into the kitchen, drawn by the ordinary ritual of making a glass of water. The kitchen was dark, only the faint glow of the digital clock on the microwave providing illumination. As I stood at the sink, the room bathed in that sickly green-blue light, I heard it, a very faint, almost imperceptible clicking sound coming from the living room, where the main, larger, cable-connected TV sat dark and dormant. It was the sound of an internal mechanism cycling, like a timer winding down or a reel turning. I froze, my heart pounding against my ribs, convinced the TV was transmitting data even without being turned on. I crept closer to the living room door, peering through the slight gap where the door didn't quite meet the frame. The darkness in the living room was absolute, yet the clicking continued, low and mechanical. Then the sound stopped, and for a brief, terrible second, just long enough for my pupil to dilate and register the light, a faint, ghostly image appeared on the surface of the darkened TV screen. It wasn't the full screen lighting up, it was an afterimage, like a cathode ray tube burning out after prolonged exposure to a single bright frame. The image lingered for perhaps half a second before fading completely back into the glass. It was the outline of the geometric symbol I had been charting for weeks, rendered in faint, residual light, like a brand burned into the TV's phosphors. It hadn't been broadcast through the cable line. It had been imprinted on the machine itself. They weren't just using the cable infrastructure. They had physically interacted with the viewing device. They had been in the house. I stumbled back, gasping, backing away from the door, the glass of water slipping from my hand and shattering on the linoleum, the sound deafening in the dead silence of the house. The symbol was inside the machine. The signal had found its way home, confirming my deepest fear. The act of observation was merely the invitation they had been waiting for.